All right, so are you ready to dive deep? Today we're going deep into Malaysian education reform.
Sounds complicated.
It is, but luckily we have this awesome documentary as our guide.
Ah, which one?
It's called How Politics is Behind Malaysia's Education Reform Difficulties from CNA Insider on YouTube.
Okay, yeah, I heard of that one.
Perfect. So you're in the right place if you want to quickly get up to speed on like all the big issues and maybe even like see if there are any good solutions out there.
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay. Well, the documentary starts off with a pretty big reality check about Malaysia's PISA scores.
PISA scores.
Yeah, PISA. It stands for Program for International Student Assessment. Basically, it's like a global benchmark, right, to see how well countries are, preparing their future workforce.
Yeah, I think I've heard of those. They look at how 15-year-olds are doing in math and science and reading, right?
Yeah, exactly. They do a pretty thorough job.
Yeah.
And it's become like a really important measure for countries that are, serious about education and future economic competitiveness and all that.
Right, makes sense.
Well, get this. In the 2022 PISA results, Malaysia had the biggest drop out of all the Asian countries. They even fell behind Vietnam.
Wow, that's a pretty big deal.
It is. Their math score alone dropped by like a crazy 31 points since 2018.
Ouch.
I know. And the science and reading scores, they weren't great either. They went down too.
Interesting. So what's the reason for that? I mean, was it just the pandemic?
Well, that's what the Malaysian Ministry of Education is saying. They blame the pandemic disruptions.
Makes sense.
But here's the thing. Vietnam and Cambodia, their scores actually got better during the pandemic.
Really?
Yeah. So that makes you wonder, right? Like, is there something else going on? Especially when you consider that back in 2013, Malaysia launched this big, ambitious education reform program. It was called the Malaysian Education Blueprint.
Oh, yeah, I remember hearing about that. What was the goal of that again?
Well, it was all about boosting those same skills that PISA measures, like English, math, science, to make Malaysian workers more globally competitive.
Sounds like a good plan. So what happened?
Right. That's the million-dollar question. And the documentary, it kind of points to a few things. Like, one of the big ones is something called implementation gaps.
Implementation gaps, what does that mean?
Basically, it means that, those policies might look great on paper, but they're not always reflected in what's actually happening in classrooms.
So like a disconnect between the theory and the practice.
Yeah, exactly. Like, imagine learning how to bake a cake, but never actually turning on the oven.
Oh, I see. So they're getting all this knowledge, but not actually putting it to use.
Pretty much. And then there's the teacher training itself, which, from what I gathered, is very heavy on theory, but maybe not so much on the practical stuff that teachers need to actually use those new methods.
Oh, interesting. I wonder if that's part of the problem. Like they're not getting the hands-on experience they need to really make those changes stick.
Yeah, it kind of makes sense, right? And then there's the whole issue of teacher evaluation.
Oh, right. How do they measure how well teachers are doing?
Well, that's part of the problem. The documentary highlights that because there's no international benchmarking, Malaysian teachers tend to rate themselves like really highly.
Really?
Yeah, which creates this kind of like inflated view of how well they're performing.
Makes sense. If you're only comparing yourself to others within the same system, you might not have a clear picture of where you stand globally.
Right. It's like comparing apples and oranges. And the documentary contrasts this with systems like Vietnam, where teachers are, given support and everything. But they're also held accountable to reach certain targets. And those who don't consistently perform well, they actually end up leaving the system.
Wow, that's quite different.
It is. And it makes you think, right? Like, what are the long-term effects of these very different approaches to teacher evaluation?
It's a good question.
It is. Okay, so speaking of shaking things up, the documentary also spent some time talking about the abolishment of the UPSR exam.
The UPSR?
Yeah, it was this national test for primary school students, and they got rid of it back in 2021.
Oh, wow.
I didn't know that. Yeah, and it caused, like, a huge debate.
Really? Why is that?
Well, for a lot of people, the UPSR was like this standard way of measuring how well students were doing.
Right.
So when they just got rid of it, people were like, wait a minute.
Yeah.
How do we know how our kids are doing?
That's fair. So what was the reasoning behind removing it?
Well, the idea was to, like, reduce the pressure on students and encourage a more holistic approach to assessment. Not just focusing on test scores.
I can see how that makes sense, but I imagine there were some people who weren't happy about it.
Oh, for sure. Some educators felt like, because they just abolished it, Like, boom, all of a sudden, without having a good alternative in place, it actually led to some kids, not being as engaged in school anymore.
Interesting. So maybe it wasn't the idea itself that was bad, but more about the implementation.
Yeah, exactly. And it really brings up this bigger question about the whole role of standardized testing in education.
Right. It's a tough one. I mean, on one hand, you want to make sure students are learning the basics, but you also don't want to create too much stress and pressure, especially for younger kids.
Absolutely. It's a tricky balance. Okay, but before we get too deep into the philosophy of it all, let's talk about a specific student that we meet in the documentary. Her name's Norlina Sofia, and she's 8 years old.
Okay. And what's her story?
Well, she's facing some pretty big challenges in school. She's having a hard time with basic reading and writing.
Oh, no, I hate to hear that. Is there a reason why?
Yeah, it seems like it's mostly because of, she comes from a low-income family and she didn't have access to preschool.
Oh, I see. So it's more about her background and circumstances than any kind of learning disability.
Yeah, exactly. And her story, it really highlights this bigger issue of educational inequality in Malaysia. The documentary talks about a World Bank report that found these huge gaps in school readiness, especially among the B40. That's the bottom 40% income group in Malaysia.
Wow, that's a lot of kids who are starting off behind.
It is. And it makes you realize that fixing this problem, it's not just about, offering more preschools. It's also about making them affordable and making sure they're actually, good quality.
Yeah, you want to make sure all kids have a fair chance to succeed, regardless of their background.
Right. Now, getting into the structure of the education system itself, the documentary dives into this whole complex issue of national schools versus vernacular schools.
Oh, interesting. Remind me, what's the difference again?
So national schools, they use Malay as the main language, and then you have vernacular schools, which use either Chinese or Tamil.
Right. I remember now. And imagine that creates some interesting dynamics within the education system.
It does. And there's this ongoing debate about whether this system is good or bad.
In what sense?
Well, some people argue that, having these separate types of schools can create divisions in society.
I can see how that could happen, but I imagine there are also arguments in favor of preserving these different types of schools.
Oh, absolutely. The documentary actually features two friends, Gomenu and Celine, who went to a Chinese vernacular school together. They talk about how much they loved it. They said the academics were really rigorous, and they had great facilities.
Makes sense. I've heard that vernacular schools often have a strong reputation for academic excellence.
Exactly. And that's actually one of the reasons why we're seeing more Malay parents sending their kids to vernacular schools these days.
Oh, really? That's interesting. So it's not just about language and culture anymore.
Right. It's about the perceived quality of education, too.
I wonder how that's shifting the dynamics within those schools.
Yeah, it's a good question. But it's not all rosy, of course. There are still those who strongly believe that vernacular schools are bad for national unity.
Right, like that idea that separate schools lead to a more divided society.
Yeah, and the documentary even mentions that former Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad wanted to get rid of them at one point.
Wow, really? That's pretty significant.
It is. And this whole debate actually went all the way to court.
No way. What happened?
Well, there was this legal challenge, and the argument was that vernacular schools were violating the Malaysian Constitution because it says that Malay is the national language.
That's a pretty serious accusation. So what did the court decide?
Well, they ended up upholding the right of vernacular schools to exist.
So they basically said that having these different types of schools isn't unconstitutional.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
They recognize that these schools, they have a long history in Malaysia, and they're an important part of the country's cultural fabric.
That makes sense. It's like trying to find that balance between national unity and cultural diversity.
It is. And it's a tough one to get right. Makes you wonder, doesn't it? How do you find that sweet spot where everyone feels included and respected, but you also have a strong sense of shared identity?
Yeah, it's a question a lot of countries struggle with, I think.
Definitely. Okay. But speaking of sensitive topics, we can't ignore the role of religion in Malaysian national schools.
Right. Specifically, the focus on Islam.
Exactly. And it's like this minefield, right? You're trying to balance religious instruction with inclusivity and academic goals, and it's tricky.
Oh, absolutely. Especially in a multi-religious country like Malaysia.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the documentary features this guy, Ada Ibrahim, who sent his kid to national schools back in the 80s. And he's really concerned now about how much emphasis there is on Islam.
Really?
What are his concerns specifically?
Well, he's worried about the impact it's having on non-Muslim students. Like, are they feeling left out? Are they getting a well-rounded education?
Yeah, I see. And it's a valid concern, I think, especially when you consider that, according to the documentary, 16% of curriculum hours are dedicated to religious education.
15%? Wow, that's a lot.
It is. And that's compared to only 12% for math. So it definitely raises some questions about priorities.
Yeah, it's a big chunk of time. And it's not just about the time either. The documentary also talks about how non-Muslim students are often separated during those religious classes. Oh, so they're not even getting the chance to, like, learn about each other's religions and cultures.
Yeah, it's kind of ironic, right? Like the system is meant to, bring everyone together, but in some ways, it's actually creating more division.
I see what you mean. So it's not just about how much time is dedicated to religious education, but also about how it's being taught and how it's impacting students from different backgrounds.
Exactly. And it seems like there's this constant back and forth, like in 2018, they tried to cut back on religious education hours, but then in 2023, they introduced a whole new Islamic module.
Oh, wow. It sounds like they're kind of going back and forth on this issue.
Yeah, it feels like a tug of war. And of course, you can't ignore the political side of it either.
Right. Like, are these decisions being made based on what's best for students, or are there other factors at play?
Exactly. And speaking of political hot potatoes, let's talk about language. Specifically, the never-ending debate about whether math and science should be taught in English or Malay.
Ah, yes, the language debate. That's a big one in many countries, not just Malaysia.
It is. And in Malaysia, it's been a real roller coaster ride. I mean, they've gone from English to Malay, back to English, and then back to Malay again.
Wow, that's a lot of changes. I can't even imagine what that must be like for teachers and students.
I know, right? And the documentary features this retired teacher, Chanya Chi, who's seen it all. She talks about how disruptive it was having to constantly adapt her teaching materials and methods every time the policy changed.
I bet. And for the students, too, it must be so hard to keep up when the language of instruction keeps shifting.
Exactly. And then to add another layer of complexity, they introduced the Dual Language Program, or DLP, in 2016.
What's that?
It basically gave some schools the option to choose whether they wanted to teach math and science in English or Malay.
Oh, so kind of like a compromise, giving schools more flexibility.
Exactly. But as with a lot of things, the devil's in the details.
Oh, I bet. So how's it been working out?
Well, it's been kind of a mixed bag. Like in Sarawak, they've fully embraced English, and they're actually seeing some really positive results.
That's encouraging. So it seems like it can work well under the right circumstances.
Right. But then on the peninsula, it's been a lot more challenging. They've actually rolled back some of the DLP guidelines recently, which has caused a lot of controversy.
It sounds like a real tug of war between those who want to stick with Malay and those who see the value in using English for certain subjects.
It is. And the documentary argues that this whole language debate, it goes way beyond just English versus Malay. It's really about the bigger issue of politics getting in the way of good education policy.
That makes sense. Language is often so tied to national identity and politics, it can be a really sensitive issue.
It is. All right, so we've uncovered some pretty deep-rooted challenges here. It can feel a bit overwhelming, but I'm curious, are there any signs of hope on the horizon? Like, are there any good things happening in Malaysian education despite all these obstacles?
I'd say so. It's not all doom and gloom. The documentary does highlight some positive developments. It's just sometimes they get overshadowed by all the challenges.
Okay, good. I was hoping you'd say that. So tell me, what are some of the bright spots? What's giving you hope?
Well, for one thing, there are some promising efforts to expand access to preschool, which we talked about earlier. And that's huge because, those early years are so critical for development.
Absolutely. And the documentary mentioned something about trying to improve teacher quality too, right?
Yes. They're looking at ways to better track teacher performance and address the issue of absenteeism, and also to find ways to make teaching a more attractive and rewarding profession.
That's great to hear. It sounds like they're recognizing that teachers are like the heart and soul of the education system, right?
Absolutely. You can have the best curriculum and the fanciest technology, but without dedicated and skilled teachers, none of it really matters.
That's so true. All right, so it's a mixed bag, right? There are these huge challenges, but there's also some momentum for positive change. It's a complex picture, for sure.
It really is. And I think this documentary does a great job of capturing that nuance.
I agree. It's been a fascinating journey so far, and I'm really eager to keep exploring this topic with you.
Me too. There's still so much to uncover. It's amazing how much we've already talked about, from those PISA scores to the whole vernacular school system, and then, of course, the role of religion. It's clear that this Malaysian education reform, it's complicated. There are so many pieces to it.
I know, right? And this documentary, how politics is behind Malaysia's education reform difficulties. It really shows how all those different factors are connected. Like they're all pulling the system in different directions, making it super hard to actually make any real progress.
It's a good point. It really is like a tug of war, with all these different forces at play. And speaking of tug of war, we can't forget that language debate. The documentary showed how different things are in Sarawak, where they've had some success with teaching math and science in English, versus the peninsula, where it seems like they're still, struggling with policies that keep changing.
Yeah, it's like two completely different worlds, and it really highlights how important it is to have regional autonomy in a country as diverse as Malaysia. What works in one place might not work in another.
Absolutely. And I think the documentary did a great job of bringing these complex issues to life by showing us those personal stories. Like, remember Norliana Sophia, that little girl who was having trouble with reading because she didn't have access to preschool,
Yeah.
and Chania Chi, that teacher who's had to deal with all those language policy changes throughout her career. Their stories, they really show how real the stakes are.
They do. It reminds us that we're not just talking about abstract ideas here. These decisions have a real impact on people's lives, and their opportunities.
Exactly. And as we get deeper into the documentary, one thing that keeps coming up is this issue of politicization. It seems like every decision about education, whether it's about language, religion, or even testing, it all gets filtered through a political lens.
It's like they're more worried about winning elections than they are about actually helping students, wouldn't you say?
Well, the documentary definitely suggests that that's a big part of the problem. A lot of the experts they interview, they say that this politicization is the main reason why reform is so hard in Malaysia. The ministers, they're always focused on the short-term political gains, instead of thinking about what's best for the future of education.
And that creates so much uncertainty and instability, right? It's like trying to build something on shifting sand.
I love that analogy. And the documentary doesn't just complain about the problem, it actually tries to explain why this is happening. It turns out that education is super tied to national identity and language and religion in Malaysia. It's a really sensitive topic.
So it's not just like bad politicians playing games. There are real, deeply held beliefs that make things more complicated.
Right. And those different beliefs clash, like in the debates about vernacular schools, about how much religious education there should be, and of course, about which language to use in schools.
It's like education is a microcosm of everything that's going on in Malaysian society, right? All the tensions and divisions play out in the school system.
You got it. And I think if you want to understand how to fix things, you have to understand those underlying tensions first. It's not enough to just say, we need better policies. You have to address those root causes of the problem.
That's a tall order, especially in a country with so much diversity and such a history of political maneuvering.
No doubt. It's a huge challenge. But I think the documentary does offer some hope by showing us some of the people and groups who are working to make things better, even with all those obstacles.
You mean those efforts to expand preschool and to improve teacher quality?
Yes. Those are great examples. And the encouraging thing is that even the policymakers are starting to realize that things can't stay the same, If Malaysia wants to become a high-tech hub, which is their goal, they need a good education system, one that teaches kids to think critically and solve problems.
So the pressure's on, not just for individual students, but for the whole country.
Exactly. The stakes are high. And while this documentary, it definitely shows us how difficult things are, it also reminds us that change is possible. It just takes a lot of work and a willingness to compromise and find common ground. It's a marathon, not a sprint, But the potential rewards are huge.
Well said. So we've unpacked all the complexities, the challenges, and some potential ways to move forward. But for our listener who maybe just started learning about this, what are the main things to take away from all this?
That's a good question. Well, I think the documentary makes a few things really clear. First, this is not something that's going to be fixed overnight. It's a long process that needs patience and a focus on solutions that are sustainable. Second, they need to get politics out of education. It's only going to work if they put students first, not political agendas.
Right. Let's focus on what's actually best for kids, not what's going to get you reelected.
Exactly. And third, we have to remember that education is about people. It's about helping students like Norley and Sophia reach their potential. It's about giving teachers like Chanichi the tools and support they need. And it's about creating a society that values education.
Yeah, a society that values education for everyone, not just for, like, the elite few.
That's it. This documentary, it really shows that education isn't just about, getting a job or whatever. It's about creating well-rounded individuals who can think for themselves and deal with whatever the world throws at them.
It's about investing in people, basically. Okay, so we've covered a lot, but there's one more thing I'm curious about.
Oh, okay. What's that?
Let's talk about the teachers, specifically how they're trained and how we can keep them motivated, because that's obviously a huge part of making any reform successful.
Yes. The teachers, the unsung heroes, they're so important, but we don't talk about them enough.
It's funny, right? We talk so much about changing the curriculum and bringing in new technology, but we often forget about the teachers.
It's true. It's like we're so focused on the tools that we forget about the people who actually use them.
Exactly. You can have the best lesson plans in the world, but if the teacher isn't, equipped to actually teach them, it's not going to work.
Makes sense.
And that's why I have found this part of the documentary, how politics is behind Malaysia's education reform difficulties, so interesting. They really dig into some of the reasons why teachers in Malaysia are struggling.
Yeah. One of the things they talked about was how overworked teachers feel. Like they're drowning in paperwork and all these tasks that have nothing to do with teaching.
Right. They're so busy with all that admin stuff that they don't have time to actually, teach.
And connect with their students, It's a problem, especially since Malaysia wants to be more, creative and innovative. How can teachers encourage those skills in their students if they're stuck doing paperwork all day?
Exactly. It's a total contradiction.
It is.
And then there's the issue of teacher absenteeism, which apparently is a pretty big problem in Malaysia. Is that something you've come across in your research?
Yeah, sadly it is. It's a serious issue because, if teachers aren't in the classroom, kids aren't learning. The documentary mentioned this report. It was by an NGO in Sabah called Tindak Guru, and they found that almost 20% of school principals had reported teacher absenteeism.
Wow, that's a lot. That's really worrying. Makes you wonder if anyone's keeping track,
Yeah.
and if there are any consequences for teachers who just don't show up.
Right. Accountability is so important. If teachers aren't showing up, what kind of message does that send to the students?
Yeah, maybe school isn't that important after all.
And I think the documentary linked this problem to that whole civil service mentality where, promotions are often based on how long you've been there, not on how well you do your job.
So the system itself, it's kind of encouraging teachers to be, not their best. Because it doesn't matter, you'll get promoted anyway.
It's a good point. It's not always about teachers lacking passion, Sometimes the system just doesn't reward them for being passionate.
So what can be done about this? The documentary mentioned something about performance tracking and professional development, right?
Exactly. They interviewed some experts who said that they need to start tracking how well teachers are actually doing and then give them the support and training they need to improve.
So basically, set high standards, but also give them the tools to meet those standards.
Right. And the documentary also talked about how useful international benchmarking can be.
Like comparing Malaysian teachers to teachers in other countries.
Yeah, so they can see where they need to improve and learn from the best.
It's like, if it works somewhere else, why not try it here? Right.
Right. But it's not just about, technical skills and stuff. It's about reminding teachers why they got into this profession in the first place, giving them back that passion, that excitement for teaching.
Because when teachers are passionate, it makes such a difference for the students, right?
100%. Kids can tell when their teacher is really invested,
That's what makes them want to learn.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've reached the end of our deep dive into Malaysian education reform. It's been quite a journey. What are some of the big takeaways you'd want our listener to remember?
Well, I think this documentary, How Politics is Behind Malaysia's Education Reform Difficulties, it really shows that this is a super complicated issue. There are no easy solutions. And you have to think about, the big picture stuff, like the structure of the system, but also the people, like the teachers and students.
It's about remembering that education is ultimately about people, right? Their hopes and their dreams and their potential.
It is. And even though there are a lot of challenges, we shouldn't lose hope. Change is possible, but it takes time and effort.
And it takes all of us, right? Not just the policymakers, but also the teachers, the parents, the students, everyone.
Absolutely. We all have a role to play.
Well said. So to our listener, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you learned something new and that you'll keep thinking about this issue. Because, as we've seen, it's super important for the future of Malaysia.
It was great to be here. And to the listener, keep learning and keep asking those tough questions.
Until next time, happy diet.